Welcome back, Sebastian here. So now it is time for my power rankings for the 2024 Formula 1 Canadian Grand Prix. So obviously that weekend that we just had in Montreal, very, very exciting. Lots of action, lots to talk about, lots of material that we can use to kind of make power rankings for this weekend's Grand Prix. So starting right away with number 20, I'm going with a driver who had another shocker of a weekend for the second race in a row, and that is Sergio Perez. So for Perez, gets knocked out in Q2 for the second weekend in a row, or in Q1 for the second weekend in a row. Has contact with Pierre Gasly on the opening laps, sending him into a half spin. Out qualified by Max Verstappen by 9/10 of a second. Then crashes into the wall on his own. So all in all, really terrible weekend for Perez, especially considering where that car should be. Should easily be in the top 4 or 5 positions, given what we're seeing with Max Verstappen, at least this past weekend. So yeah, another really tough weekend for Perez. Number 19 is Logan Sargent. For Sargent, qualifying was a bit better than usual. Was relatively close to Albon in terms of qualifying, but still out qualified by him. The race was pretty tricky though. Had 2 moments. First moment, was able to recover the car, keep going. Second time, unfortunately, got hit the wall quite hard, and that brought out the safety car. So 2 moments in the race for Sargent. Not ideal, definitely in pretty tricky conditions, but of the drivers on track, most drivers did pretty well. Sargent was one of the ones who unfortunately made several mistakes on track. Number 18, I'm going to go with Zhou Guangyu. For Zhou, this weekend in Montreal was very, very tricky. All through the practice sessions, he had been struggling, caused 2 red flags in practice, FP1 and in FP3, qualified dead last, out qualified by Bottas by 9/10 of a second, I believe. The race itself, not really a whole lot you can say. Of course, he had that 90-second pit stop disaster roughly, which put him a lap down. Obviously, that's not his fault, but still, yeah, really, really tricky weekend for Zhou. Number 17, I'm going to go with Carlos Sainz. For Sainz, outraced Charles Leclerc, I guess, technically, but of course that's just because Leclerc retired earlier than he did. For Sainz, qualifying was pretty tough, got knocked out in Q2, but that being said, we know that the Ferrari was having issues, and with their crazy strategy where they tried to get out of Q2 on used soft tires, we knew that was a very risky strategy. And to be honest, the margin between himself and Leclerc was pretty small, so not really blaming him too much for qualifying. The race itself, as far as we know, he didn't have any issues with the car, especially not like Leclerc did. But still, for Sainz, he really struggled to get into the points. I think only got into the points at the very, very end, right before he made that mistake, spun, and took himself and Alex Albon out of the Grand Prix. Number 16 is Yuki Tsunoda. For Tsunoda, a bit of a tough weekend, out-qualified and out-raced by his teammate Daniel Ricciardo. For Tsunoda, qualifying was okay, got himself up into Q3, so that's definitely a good result in the RB car. The race itself, got himself up into a good position, P7, P8 for a lot of the Grand Prix. Unfortunately made that mistake towards the end, spinning at the one of the final chicanes before the hairpin. And yeah, almost had a very nasty crash with Nico Hülkenberg there. Luckily, didn't happen. Hülkenberg was able to avoid Tsunoda's car. But that being said, I think Tsunoda will be quite disappointed with how this weekend went, especially with that mistake, given that points were on offer. Number 15, I'm going to go with Valtteri Bottas. For Bottas, out-qualified and out-raced his teammate Zhou Guangyu. For Bottas, it felt like the car was an absolute disaster in qualifying. That being said, out-qualified Zhou by quite a good margin. And then in the race, basically, of course, started from the pit lane on those with a kind of, I guess, a wet setup. And then kind of just drove as best as he could. Ended up P13, I believe, at the checkered flag, which is honestly not too bad of a result for Sauber. Number 14, I'm going to go with Charles Leclerc. For Leclerc, this was a very tough weekend. That being said, almost all of the issues for him were outside of his control. There was the botched qualifying with the used soft tires. There was the engine issue that was costing him half a second a lap on the straights. There was the, again, botched strategy call to go with hards when it should have gone with intermediates. So all of those things kind of added up and caused Leclerc to end up a lap down before he eventually retired from the Grand Prix. Really, really tricky result. Not really a whole lot I think he could have done to avoid it. So unfortunately, I can't really rank him that much higher, but I'm not going to punish him either for that. Number 13, I'm going to go with Nico Hülkenberg. Pretty solid weekend, I felt, for Hülkenberg. Qualifying obviously was a bit of a struggle. Out-qualified by a pretty massive margin, I believe 7/9 tenths of a second. To his teammate Kevin Magnussen knocked out in Q1 as well. So that was a bit of a surprise. The race itself was not so bad. Of course, gambled on the wet tires at the start. Made up quite a few good positions, but again, so did his teammate who was also on those wet tires. And then, yeah, kind of came home to a 12th place result. I think he'll be fairly happy, or 11th place result. So I think he'll be fairly happy with that. Number 12, I'm going to go with his teammate Kevin Magnussen. Really a whole lot of it, what I just said, applies an opposite to Magnussen. For Magnussen, decent result. The only reason I put him ahead of Hülkenberg was, despite the fact that Hülkenberg finished a position ahead, was because that gap in qualifying was so massive. But nonetheless, a decent result for both drivers. Number 11, I'm going to go with Lance Stroll. For Stroll, I think he had a pretty decent race, home Grand Prix. Qualified in Q3 at Montreal for the first time in his career, which, given how long his career is definitely something he should have done before this year. Then in the race, I think he had a pretty safe strategy. He was running P7, P8 for most of the Grand Prix, a little bit behind his teammate Fernando Alonso, but then again, never really looked like challenging Alonso either, but still, I think, pretty solid result. Number 10, I'm going to go with Alex Albon. For Albon, really strong Grand Prix, out-qualified and out-raced his teammate Logan Sargent. Got himself up into Q3 for the first time this season, I believe. And then in the race, looked like he was going to be on for a point for most of the Grand Prix, and then unfortunately had that coming together with Carlos Sainz. Nothing he could really do. Just unfortunate that he went the same way as Sainz's car ended up rolling. And yeah, just really unfortunate incident there for Albon on a weekend that he looked very, very strong. Number 9, I'm going to go with Esteban Ocon. For Ocon, we know that in qualifying he set the car up for the race, presumably for the wet conditions, because he knew that he was carrying that 5-point grid penalty for what happened at Monaco. In the Grand Prix, I thought did a really good job with the strategy, made that first set of intermediate tires last as long as he could, and basically skipped an entire pit stop, and then basically was running in the points towards the end, and then was unfortunately asked to swap positions with his teammate Pierre Gasly, which I think was a little bit unnecessary. Speaking of Gasly, that's the driver I've decided to put at number 8. Out-qualified and out-raced Ocon. But that being said, like I just said, the out-racing part was really just because he was asked to switch positions at the end. And again, qualifying does have that asterisk. And I think, both drivers did a really good job overall, considering the circumstances, especially since Gasly was basically sent into a half spin by Perez on that opening lap. Number 7, I'm going to go with Lewis Hamilton. Despite the fact that in interviews he said that was one of the worst races of his career, I think the Grand Prix itself was honestly pretty good. Got past Ricciardo at the start, got past Alonso as well towards the first pit stop phase, and towards the end of the race was very, very close to the leaders and looked like he could have easily challenged for a podium position. Obviously, I'm not sure exactly what happened at the end there with Russell, where he lost that podium position after overtaking Piastri, but I guess sometimes these things happen. And really, the reason I put him in 7th and not perhaps in the top 5 is because I do feel like qualifying did let him down again this weekend. Qualified P7 while his teammate was on pole position, out-qualified by 0.2 of a second. I think it's definitely starting to become a bit of a story, given in the first 9 races he's only out-qualified George Russell once. Number 6, I'm going to go with Fernando Alonso. Really solid weekend again for the Spaniard. Qualified, where did he qualify? I believe qualified P6, and then finished P6 in the race as well. I felt like the Aston Martins didn't really have the pace of the Mercedes, the McLarens, or the Red Bull, so I think it's understandable that he finished in 6th place, and it would be unrealistic to expect him to really finish beyond that. And yeah, just brought the car home. Really good chunk of points for Aston Martin as well today. Number 5, I'm going with Daniel Ricciardo. Really excellent result, I feel, on paper. There were some issues, I think, in the Grand Prix itself, but that's, a different story. Qualified P5, and then had, of course, was given a 5-second penalty for that jump start. The jump start didn't help him from the onboard, like I said in my review earlier this morning. It didn't really look from the onboard camera. You can't really tell that it's a jump start. So it's a bit of a harsh penalty to give, but nonetheless, that's exactly what's written in the rules. That being said, recovered very well from that penalty that he showed during one of his pit stops, and was able to recover to P8 on the road. Of course, I think was aided a bit by Tsunoda spinning out. I believe he was behind Tsunoda at that point. But these things happened. He did a really good job and kept it on the road. Number 4, I'm going to go with George Russell. For Russell, qualifying was excellent. Qualified on pole position. And then in the early stage of the race, it was doing a really good job of controlling the pace. Made a couple of mistakes, so of course that one mistake cutting the wall of champion chicane, and towards the end when he cut the turn 3-4 chicane. So a bit of some tricky moments during the race there, but overall I do think he had a pretty good weekend. Number 3, I'm going to go with Oscar Piastri. Now, it may be a bit of a surprise I would have Piastri so high given he finished P5 on the road, but I honestly felt like he had a really, really strong Grand Prix. While he may have lacked the ultimate pace of his teammate, Lando Norris, who hasn't shown up yet, he didn't really I don't think he made any mistakes, whereas almost every other driver in the top 5, top 6 made at least 1 or 2 small mistakes throughout the race. And I think also got a little bit unfortunate with the timing of that late safety car at the end, where he was passed by both Mercedes. Otherwise, it could have easily been a McLaren 2-3 on the podium. Now, speaking of McLaren on the podium, number 2, I've gone with Lando Norris. For Norris, I felt like he had a really strong weekend. Out-qualified, outraced Piastri. Again, easily could have won that Grand Prix. I feel like the main reason why he didn't win the Grand Prix was because of the strategy. Basically losing the lead at that point when Sargent had his incident. That being said, for Norris, very similar to Verstappen. I honestly think the two are very, very close, very even. Both of them had similar incidents at turn 1, and I think overall you could easily put the other Norris P1, and of course Verstappen, who I haven't written down yet, P2. But nonetheless, really strong weekend for Norris, and also I guess in qualifying there's a little bit of a gap there, minuscule, but still a tiny gap there in qualifying as well. Now, number 1, Max Verstappen. Honestly, really solid Grand Prix as well for him. This was a weekend where I don't think they expected to win. They knew that they were going to have issues with the curbs, and we saw towards the later stage of the race, Verstappen was on the radio complaining about those said curbs. So I think, perhaps Red Bull's a bit surprised that Verstappen got the win today, but nonetheless, excellent drive from Verstappen, excellent in qualifying, tied Russell for pole, I guess, starting P2, and then in the race, obviously had that one incident at turn 1, but nonetheless kept it clean for the most part, and the pace was very, very solid when it needed to be. But nonetheless, I think, you're going to make him a case for Norris also being first on the power rankings. So there you go. There's my power rankings for the 2024 Canadian Grand Prix. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.